We the people.
We the people.
We the people of the United States.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
In the summer of 1787, 55 men gathered in Philadelphia to consider how to make the government of the United States more perfect. Over the course of 5 months, they argued, debated, considered and rejected ideas, notions, and various systems. In the end, they created the Constitution of the United States, a document predicated on the idea that men can rule themselves by law. This is Constitution Thursday, a time when we look at the history, ideas, arguments, and interpretations of the Constitution, from its original creation to today, and how it affects our lives now.
Well, good evening. As we continue our series on 1876, we're looking at a lot of the election of 1876 and how much of what we're seeing today can actually trace itself back to that election. The most contested election in American history. I know these politicians today like to say that 2000, 2004, 2016, they had nothing. They weren't even in the same league as the controversies over the 1876 election, and that's kind of where we're going with a lot of what we're talking about right now. You want to join me? You can. Text machine is, of course, area code 209-565-DAVE. That's 209-565-3283. Email is dave@thedavebowmanshow.com, and of course, we're on the web. Just look for The Dave Bowman Show on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, Anchor, and whatever preferred non-denominational web search browser you use. When we left you, the election of 1876 was getting ready. We talked a lot about the issues in South Carolina. We talked about the Democrat Party and what they were going through. And again, I warn you, please do not use anything that I'm about to say, anything you're about to hear on this program, as proof, and I'm doing the air quote thing again, proof that the Democrats are bad and the Republicans are good. Please don't do that. Not because you may not believe that, but because, again, by the time we get done with this, neither party, you're going to see, neither party is going to look good at this. Neither party is going to look like they really give a damn about anything except power, which is pretty much the truth today. When the conventions were completed and the campaigning really began, Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden followed the traditions of the era. Now, but what do I mean by that? The two candidates themselves did very little actual campaigning. It was considered kind of not beneath the candidate, but it was a big country. The only way to get around was train or horse, and telegraph, of course, newspapers, that sort of thing. But actually going to 37, 38 states was an impracticality. It just wasn't going to happen. So they would focus on specific areas, but as a general rule, they left the campaigning to their subordinates and to their friends and supporters throughout the country. That was the norm in those days. As the election of 1876 approached, there were 369 electoral votes in the Electoral College at that time. Remember, it's based on how many votes, how many senators, and how many representatives each state has. The minimum a state can have is 3. But I guess there's no theoretical upward maximum at this point. The spread out of the states caused many of the states to be relatively low in their numbers, but some states were much bigger than others, obviously. And as always, the Electoral College was designed to make someone reach a consensus, to build a consensus across rather than to reward popular voting. That's something that gets forgotten again every time there's an election because the loser always complains about it. But as a general rule of thumb, it works pretty good. The two parties, of course, had their platforms because that's what you do when you come out of your convention. As part of that is you build the planks of your particular platform, as it were. And of course, the GOP platform was pretty much its standard fare: hard money, support businesses, foreign affairs, that sort of thing. But the biggest difference between the two parties was this right here. GOP platform contained a commitment to the permanent pacification of the southern section of the Union and the complete protection of all its citizens in the free enjoyment of all their rights. These are duties to which the Republican Party is sacredly pledged. Now, you'll notice that there are words that do not actually appear there, and that's a good thing, I think, in that party. It simply refers to everyone as citizens. Of course, they're specifically referring to the freedmen, the former slaves in the South, who by this point we've already talked about. Even though the Civil Rights Act of 1875 has been passed, many of the states which have been reconstructed, or at this point there's only 3 that really haven't been, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, many of the states have already started to pass laws restricting the rights of citizens to vote based on the color of their skin, based on their wealth, based on those sorts of things, even though the 15th Amendment specifically prohibits this. They don't care. They're passing laws because even though the 14th Amendment is in place, incorporation is not. And as we're going to see in a few years from now, that's exactly what the Supreme Court is going to rule about what we would refer to today as Jim Crow laws, that the laws themselves might be unconstitutional, but can't legislate what people do. The Democrat platform is interesting in that it studiously avoids any mention, any upbeat of the rights of citizens to vote. It does, however, call for the immediate reform of the federal government, which is, again, code for we want to end Reconstruction. We want to get all of the troops out of the South and start governing ourselves. In order to forestall Republican charges of sectionalism, that's Southernism, Southern versus North, they did commit themselves to the permanence of the federal union. Now, this is kind of unusual because prior to this, the Democrats had never done this. They had, as we're going to remind ourselves here in a little bit, most of the secessionists were Democrats. Most of the Democrat states were secession states. But in this particular case, even though they are committed, and the Bourbon Democrats, as we talked about last week, are committed to white supremacy, Redeemers are certainly committed to that, and their paramilitary organizations are threatening for that. They call for permanence of the federal union on their terms, which they believe they can dictate if they win the White House, the Senate, and the House. They also called for civil service reform, which is, again, as we've said, this is something we don't talk about anymore. We don't even bat an eye. In fact, we don't even pay attention to the civil service, which is exactly what they want. The civil service doesn't want you to even know it exists, let alone that it's that it might need reform. But in those days, the patronage system, so forth and so on, caused a great deal of corruption, and both Tilden and Hayes wanted to reform it. Interestingly enough, the Democrats also called for restrictions on Chinese immigration to the United States. Now, there were some reasons for this that might interest you, or they might not. The nation was in the middle of what is commonly recognized now as the absolute worst depression we've ever been with, worse even than the Great Depression, numerically speaking. The reason that we were in that depression was, or a lot of the entire world was in the depression, but one of the major factors in that was railroads and railroad land speculation. To make a long story short, in the previous probably 2 to 3 years that the Depression had started in 1873, railroads were no longer really being built, and this restriction on Chinese immigration was seen as kind of a protectionist measure so that when railroads did start getting built again, Chinese immigrants wouldn't be taking jobs Americans don't want to do, so to speak. Kind of an interesting look on this. These two platforms, though, the thing about politics, and you've got to keep this in mind, politics appeals to the lowest common denominator. There's a phrase in politics, play the man, not the ball. Simplify things. If you can label someone, it doesn't really matter what they say because all anybody hears is label. All anybody sees is the oversimplification. And so many of the Southern newspapers, many of the Southern campaigners simplified the two platforms as follows. Democrat platform is for the white man, and the Republican platform is for the Negro. And they made sure to draw Tilden looking pretty Tilden-esque and almost Hayes-esque in a lot of ways. Well, they made sure to draw the representative of the Republican platform as caricature, as stereotypical as you can imagine someone of that era drawing an African American. It's almost embarrassing. We look at it today, and of course, none of this would fly. This would be immediately, and without any hesitation, this would be condemned. It would be withdrawn. It would be, I don't know if it would be mocked or not, but it certainly would be not kosher. But in that era, in simplification terms, in simplifying the platforms of the two parties, that's what the Bourbon Democrats did. They were specifically appealing to white Northerners and white Southerners to vote for Democrats because the Republicans were, as you saw there, committed to defending the rights of all citizens, which the Democrat Party in that era did not like Black Americans. It didn't want to give them the votes, and they were already passing laws not to do that. In order to label people further, the Democrats labeled Hayes as waving the bloody shirt. This is a political cartoon. You're watching the video of Rutherford B. Hayes being forced by some Republican leaders there today, and I'm not going to bother with who they are, but he's being forced to don the bloody shirt. Bloody shirt is an emblem, and it's also a metaphor for a lot of things in that era. As I said, the campaigns were done by other individuals. The candidates themselves did very little campaigning. One of the campaigners for Hayes was a guy by the name of Colonel Robert Ingersoll. He gave a speech in 1876 that was really mocked as waving the bloody shirt. And what he said was, and I quote here, "Every man that tried to destroy this nation was a Democrat. Every enemy this great republic has had for 20 years has been a Democrat. Every man that shot Union soldiers was a Democrat. Every man that denied to the Union prisoners even the worm-eaten crust of famine. When some poor, emaciated Union patriot, driven to insanity by famine, saw in an insane dream the face of his mother, she beckoned him and he followed, hoping to press her lips once again to his fevered face. When he stepped one step beyond the deadline and the wretch that put the bullet through his loving, throbbing heart was and is a Democrat." This is recalling to mind the sacrifices that are being made. Part of the problem with the lost cause myth that has become so prevalent in our national mentality today goes back to the question I was asked: why do so many people forget what this war was really about, which was to end slavery? Part of that is the erasing of that mindset. And we see in the waving of the bloody shirt accusations being made against Hayes and other Republicans at that time, that this was really something the Democrats wanted to downplay. They wanted people to forget that the Union had sacrificed greatly to free the slaves. They just wanted that forgotten. And anytime a Union or Republican would bring it up, they would be accused of waving the bloody flag, a bloody shirt. They would be mocked in the newspapers, especially the Southern newspapers, of not trying to, unite the country, but to divide the country. Letters to editors were written. This was one of the more interesting ones that I found. This is a letter to the editor of a New Orleans paper. The Democrat Party is marching under a starry banner of a reconciled republic, fraternal and free, while the Republican Party marches under the banner of the bloody shirt. And then he goes on to talk about why that is. Governor Tilden, will preserve law-abiding liberty, will maintain orderly progress with Jacksonian firmness. Well, that appeals to Democrats. At the same time, he will clean out the pestiferous brood of public plunderers who have stolen the people poor. Hold high aloft the flag of the free. Push forward the standard of the punisher of thieves, this is absolutely fascinating to me, given our current argument over the Confederate battle flag in today's world. The Democrats of the 1876 era, they were the ones who laid claim to the American flag rather than the Confederate battle flag as their symbol, and accused the Republicans of flying the bloody shirt as their banner. The campaign was getting vicious, folks. I mean, it was, like I said, Tilden ran the first national newspaper campaign, and see letters like that in newspapers all across the country from that era. You see Republicans trying desperately to counter them, but not really doing a good job of it. But speeches like the ones that Ingersoll gave were pretty much the norm. And there wasn't much else you could do about it. There was some pushback. This is a political cartoon of that day, which is entitled Macbeth. It's Banquo and Macbeth, for those of you who know your Shakespeare, with Tilden being portrayed as Macbeth, having stolen his authority and his position, and being rebuked by Horace Greeley, who had helped him some years before. And there's a lot of visual, tactile kind of ties in here to Shakespeare, which, of course, back in those days, everybody knew. Everybody would have understood this. I was kind of giggling yesterday because I saw a meme that I really liked that had to do with the French Revolution. But Twitter, and it had replaced the French revolutionaries, Robespierre, with Twitter heads cutting off the heads of newspaper editors. And I thought it was clever and well done. And I posted it on my personal page, and nobody got it. And I thought to myself, well, I'm very concerned with the fact that people don't understand this, that we've gotten so far away from history that we don't understand this. But the same is true of Shakespeare. We don't really grasp the lessons that a play like Macbeth would give us. It's a little disconcerting, but at the same time, it's also true. I mean, these people were steeped in this kind of literature, and they understood these references. But again, like today, people are hearing their own echo chamber. In other words, people in New York weren't reading papers in Georgia, from Georgia. They weren't trying to learn what the other side thought. They were trying to repetitively stay within their own echo chamber. I hate that phrase, but it is true. And you weren't going to convince a Hayes voter to vote for Tilden, and vice versa. You just, not by logic, you weren't going to do it. You weren't going to win an argument between the two. Because for every argument in favor of the fact that, we freed the slaves, we passed the 15th Amendment, there's a counter argument from the other side about states' rights, and that sort of thing. And you see there, I mean, I don't have more proof to give you about the fact that even the Democrats were grabbing onto the American flag, the flag of freedom and liberty and defending America and reconciled reunion And this was normal. And of course, the same thing we see today. You weren't going to change people's votes by logic. You weren't going to convince them to change their minds. That just wasn't going to happen. But over and over again, we saw with the Redeemers last week, 2 weeks ago, the idea was to simply eliminate, prevent, intimidate, scare, and if need be, kill freedmen, African-American citizens now, not former slaves, from voting, and convince 10 to 15% of the white voters in the South to vote Democrat, the white Republicans to vote Democrat. If you could do that, you're going to win. And so there was a great amount of intimidation going on. There was a great amount of, convincing, quote unquote, people to vote Democrat. And it wasn't unusual to see scenes like this. This was portrayed in Harper's Weekly, and it's an example. It's not a definitive. It's not a photograph of it happening. But there was enough discussion of this sort of thing happening where this freedman is going to vote, and two white Southern chivalrists have their pistols pointed at his head. And if you go in a little bit closer, you'll notice that the vote thing that he has in his hands now says Democrat ticket. He's going to vote Democrat because really, at that point, don't you think how many of us are willing to vote our conscience when somebody has a gun to our head? Something that I've asked many, many times. We talk about we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But when a gun is to our head and when the rubber meets the road, how many of us really, really are willing to put our convictions and our lives on the line for that? Sadly, I don't think it's as many of us as we say we are. I remember a conversation with John one day on the air about it was a lot easier, something to the effect of it was a lot easier to be a firebrand when I wasn't a father, when I had nothing to lose. Now that I'm a father, now that I have Ben, I'm not so sure anymore that I would go the directions that I talked about going before. And I think that's true of a lot of people. And when you see that guy, you see that freedman trying to vote, he doesn't want to vote Democrats. The Democrats have already said. One of them, this is a quote, okay, and actually from next week's show, but it's a quote, so it's a kind of a precursor of next week's show. There's a leading Democrat at this time, a leading Democrat newspaperman, who will literally say, all good Southerners will piss on the 15th Amendment. We don't recognize it. We don't believe in it. The 15th Amendment, of course, securing the right to vote without regards to the color of your skin. And they know this. And so it's like, well, this forcing and intimidation is so commonplace that then President Grant, who doesn't want to rule by the bayonet anymore, Reconstruction has really drained the nation down. This 1876 year has been just a disaster for that. The things we don't think about, the defeat at the Greasy Grass, the Little Bighorn, have shocked the nation as to the effectiveness of the military. Think about this. If you're a Southerner and you hate Reconstruction and the troops, and you see these troops down there that are, it's 10 years after the end of the Civil War, the fighting portion of the Civil War, and the Little Bighorn happens, you start wondering, really, how effective can these troops be? Can they if Sitting Bull and Ogallala and those group can beat them, well, they got no chance against us anymore, right? And these kinds of thoughts are rolling through people's heads. When they go to the polls, and the election isn't like it is today, where you have, ABC, NBC, CNN, CBS, Yahoo, Comedy Central, everybody counting votes and exit polling, and, by 9 o'clock Pacific time, we usually know who the winner's going to be because they've already called it. It didn't work that way in those days. It took weeks for this to go on. And as each little bit would dribble in, Democrats and Republicans would meet at the local bars, and they would see who had what and who was leading by much, and they would bet on this. And they would say, okay, we're going to win by this much or that much, and odds were put. But when the initial results are finally in for the election, Tilden has just barely, just over 51%, just over 50% of the popular vote. Now, this will be the only time in history that this happens. I've heard of, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, they've been whining about this for years, and I understand that. They did not do what Tilden did. Tilden will get a majority of the vote. He will get not just a plurality, not just more votes than his opponent, but still less than 50%. Tilden will get 50% of the votes, just a tad over 50%. It's so close. So close. And remember, you need a whole lot less electoral college votes in that era. If you went with the initial results, Tilden wins in the electoral college by about 20 votes on the initial results. The problem is that those three states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, 7 and 4, that's 11, and 8 is 19. There is a disputed vote in Oregon, but it doesn't really come into play here. But these 19 votes, these 19 electoral college votes in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina are disputed. Now, we talked about Hamburg, South Carolina, and the issues in South Carolina and the violence in South Carolina. That is why that was happening. The Democrats were trying to intimidate their way into getting those 19 electoral college votes in those three states. And as the unreconstructed states, these states, unlike Texas and Arkansas and Mississippi and Georgia and even Virginia, were run by Reconstruction governments, i.e., Republican governors with Republican state legislatures that included African American citizens. And this, of course, was an anathema to the Bourbon Democrats that didn't handle that, which was the whole point of all of this going on. In the process of this, those 19 votes became a sticking point. If Tilden gets one of those votes, if you take those 19 votes out, he has 184, and he wins. And so if he gets one of those states, he wins the election. Conversely, Hayes is exactly 19 away himself. So if he gets all three, he wins by one vote. There's probably some hanky-panky in those numbers, but that's the way it worked out. And so over the course of those weeks that this is going on, over the course of the time it takes them to count these electoral college votes, those 19 votes become disputed. They become challenged. They become argued over. The states themselves, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, run by Republican legislatures and Republican governors, declare that they have gone for Hayes, and therefore Hayes is the winner. But of course the Democrats, and the reason they do this, they throw out all of the areas where there was great intimidation and voter misconduct and ballot stuffing and the thing we talked about before with the voter intimidation. Guns to the head, you'll vote this way. They throw out all of those votes, all of those results. They just throw them out, which is enough to give the state in question to Hayes. And so, on second appearance, on reconsideration, Hayes wins the election by one electoral college vote over Tilden. And of course, this is where the insanity that is the 1876 election, which in many ways I believe leads to where we are today, begins. I mean, it really starts here. Up to this point, we've had violence. Up to this point, we've had arguments. Up to this point, we've had pointing, not painting. We've had bloody shirts. We've had intimidation. We've had voter being killed because of the color of their skin. We've had Bourbon Democrats saying point blank no to the 15th. We don't care what the 15th Amendment says. We don't care what the 1875 Civil Rights Act says. We don't care. We are going to reestablish a white supremacist government in all of these states. And there ain't nothing you can do about it. We don't care. They are not going to stand by and let those 3 states go for Hayes, who has, as part of the party platform, promised to uphold the rights of all citizens. Ay, ay, ay. See the problem? Well, you think 2000 was an entertaining process? I mean, I've said it before. I'm a guy that likes chaos. I love watching people run around with their heads cut off. It just amuses me greatly. California recall election for governor. I said it at the time. This is a stupid recall. I voted against the recall, but then made sure that my vote for the next person coming in was well placed on someone that I thought would create more chaos. So I voted for Gary Coleman. This is kind of the same situation that we had in 2000, but it's going to go much longer because Inauguration Day is not in January yet. It's still in March. So we have November, December, January, February, March. We got 4 months of you stole this, no, you stole that, no, you killed people, you cheated that way, you did the the likes of which we have never seen here in our times. At the closest thing you could possibly compare to it is 1960, and I'm not even sure that's in the same category. This thing is going to weigh down the election. They're going to end up, and we're going to get a little bit ahead here, they're going to establish an electoral commission to figure this whole thing out, because somebody's got to make a decision as to whether or not these votes that were thrown out by those 3 states are valid or not. Somebody's going to have to make that decision. And in the meantime, Tilden and Hayes are both climbing on that donkey of that election commission, trying to figure out and control what's going to happen. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this, and it's no big surprise given what's going on in the world at this time, it's no big surprise given how these people are acting and what they're saying and what they believe, is that there begin to be small groups. It starts in Baltimore of all. It starts in Baltimore, which, again, to the Republicans is not surprising. As Colonel Ingersoll had said earlier, Democrats shot at Union soldiers. Well, many people will point out that this movement starts in Baltimore, where they shot the first Union soldiers. So there's a whole lot of problems going on. And in the midst of all this, the Democrats are going to make it clear that they want Tilden to be president, and they are prepared to filibuster. They are prepared to walk out. They are prepared to do anything and everything legislatively possible to make sure that Hayes does not become president of the United States and that Samuel J. Tilden does, because if he does, Reconstruction is done. Their troops will be removed. Reform of the United States government. Chinese will be banned from coming in. And by God, all those Republican patronage holders will be done away with. And we won't have to pay any attention to that 1875 Civil Rights Act or the 15th Amendment. And this movement begins with little patches that they put on their lapels that they can flip up and show people that they're a part of this movement, that they are in favor of what will be known as Tilden or blood. And they make it clear. At first, it's just kind of a slogan. At first, it's just a few miscreants in Baltimore and a few other places. At first, it's just a small movement. But by the new year, it will be made clear that the South, the Bourbon Democrats, are prepared to, ready to, and are already wearing their Confederate uniforms, carrying their Confederate battle flags. They are ready to start a second civil war over the election of 1876.